Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. Islamophobia is everywhere. It's a narrative and history woven so deeply into our everyday lives that we don't even notice it, in our education, how we travel, our healthcare, legal system, and at work. Behind the scenes, it affects the most vulnerable, at the border, and in prisons. Despite this, the conversation about Islamophobia is relegated to microaggressions and slurs. At best, we see it as an individual moral failing to be condemned, though amongst the political elite, Islamophobia is more likely to enhance than hinder careers. In Tangled and Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia, the newest book in our Outspoken by Pluto series, Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan scrutinises not just what Islamophobia is, but what it does. Islamophobia not only lives under the skin of those who it marks, but it is an international political project designed to divide people in the name of security in order to materially benefit global stakeholders. Well, it's a real privilege to be joined on the show today by Suhaiymah to talk about a number of the issues covered in the new book and to get her thoughts as well on the hugely popular Trojan Horse affair podcast and the discourse that has been emerging recently around the refugee crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As ever, podcast listeners can get 50% off the book, Tangled and Terror, through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Okay, without any further ado, here is Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan on Radicals in Conversation. Well, Suhaiymah, thanks so much for joining us today. It's really lovely to have you on the podcast. And congratulations on having the book published, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. It's out now with Pluto Press. It's in our Outspoken by Pluto series. And it's a really wonderful addition to the series. I'm sure people that have picked up other books in that series will want to read this, and I hope so, particularly after our conversation today. Where did the idea for the book come from? Was it like a logical step for you based on the work that you've been doing up until this point? Or was it a bit of a departure? You know, will people picking it up see a continuity with, your poetry, for instance?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the congratulations. And yeah, I think with the book, I guess a lot of my poetry did deal with these themes already in terms of the reality of what it means to experience being criminalized on the basis of your identity, being racialized as Muslim in Britain. And even, I had poems that did deal specifically with things like the British values, counter-extremism agenda. But I think that the book offered the opportunity to really rigorously analyze the different discourses that I think in poetry you can speak to and you can disrupt, but you don't necessarily get that space to really break it down with an evidentiary basis and to, I suppose, provide like a really useful analytical framework to then look at how Islamophobia manifests and how we might resist it. So yeah, it's not I wouldn't say it's a huge departure, but I would say it's a very different approach. And I hope one that feels quite, useful for people.
So, the book is called Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. What are some of the common narratives then that we tend to hear around Islamophobia? And I suppose, how does your book then interject with a different perspective?
Yeah, so I think, even with the idea of writing a book about Islamophobia, I was very aware that in the mainstream, conversations around Islamophobia have tended to focus on the fact that, there are parliamentary attempts to define Islamophobia. You've kind of had conversations around, is the media Islamophobic? Does Islamophobia exist within the Tory party? We need investigations and all of this kind of thing. So it tended to be, in my opinion, a conversation very focused on the kind of definition in a legislative framework of what Islamophobia is. And then on the other hand, you kind of have, infrequent outrages about comments that, let's say, when Boris Johnson called women who wear niqab bank robbers or letterboxes, you kind of have this outrage that recognizes that, this is an Islamophobic form of verbal harassment or whatever you might call it. And I guess after Brexit, you have things like people talking about the hate crime spike that Muslim women in particular face. So all of those things were there, but I kind of felt like in every case, the way that Islamophobia was talked about was very reductive, because those things to me are very surface level manifestations of Islamophobia. They're the kind of tip of the iceberg. And I think what was missing in those conversations was, okay, well, what is the context you have to have created to enable people to even, voice slurs like that, or to direct anger and hatred in ways that manifest on the bodies of Muslim women. Like, what contexts have to exist for that to happen? And so for me, that was then a question of looking historically, and not even just in terms of like 20 years of the war on terror, but going even further back than that, and thinking about, what ideological bedrock, I suppose, has to exist, but also why it exists. And I think that was one of the things I felt was really missing in conversations around Islamophobia. They sometimes kind of just talk about like a random hatred, a moral deficiency. Some people are just bad and mean and Islamophobic. And with that, there's no real analysis because there's no real motive. And I think what I wanted to do with this book was really say, actually, Islamophobia is very beneficial for states. It enables them to justify a lot of security policies. And for corporations, it enables there to be, a really profitable industry in terms of selling surveillance technologies, or selling, arms, or any number of things that are justified in the name of defending states or borders or the world from a Muslim threat. So yeah, I just felt that the kind of standard narrative is very basic, and misses a lot of the points that I think help us then organize and direct resistance.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, the individualizing of like racist acts, slurs and whatnot, is misguided, but also then actively unhelpful. It's an obscuring thing to sort of focus overly on these manifestations of something deeper.
Absolutely. I think it means that we then don't hold accountable any of the institutions and the structures that actually actively cultivate Islamophobia. I think it's a really clever diversion. Not that it's necessarily, a conspiracy, but I think we are diverted to focus on individuals rather than structures.
So, I mean, you write in the book that Islamophobia is one strategy of a colonial world system that was built over, a period of 500 or so years. And the empire, the British Empire, is obviously no more in name. But, would you say we've left the colonial world system in which Islamophobia operates behind? Or is it still ongoing,
Well, yeah, this is an interesting question, isn't it? Because I think that the more research that I did into Islamophobia, the more difficult it becomes to really draw a clear line between, where colonialism ends and the world that we're in now. And that was really interesting to me because I think I don't only mean that from the ideological perspective, in the sense that one of the parallels I really try to draw is that throughout the 17 and 1800s, you have thinkers, philosophers, all sorts of different mouthpieces producing the knowledge that then comes to justify racism. So, people who are Enlightenment philosophers coming up with the notion of race and kind of demarcating different races, or, scientists saying that they're measuring skulls and they're figuring out, which races are lesser or, have greater intellect, etc. And I think the parallel I tried to draw in terms of that construction of race as an ideological tool is really clear to see today, in the sense that you have criminologists, psychologists, media outlets, politicians, and think tanks, and and other places, all producing different types of knowledge, research, quote unquote evidence that does the same thing when it comes to Muslims, creating this idea of, Muslims are people who speak in this way, who behave in this way, who exhibit these cultural defects, who have a propensity to violence, and you'll be able to determine who they are by the language that they speak, or the places that they live, or the clothes that they wear. And so in the ideologies that underpin colonialism, you saw that happening, and you see that happening today. And then the other parallel was that in both cases, doing that ideological construction of race has material benefits. And we obviously the occupation and domination of lands across the world, and the pillaging of resources through empire. But then today, really, you see the same thing through the war on terror. You have that imperialist kind of extraction of resources. People can think of the war in Iraq, but other places across the world too. And I think you have these other streams of revenue that Islamophobia also produces, which are very much colonial, in the sense of, if you're selling arms and buying arms, drone warfare, but then also these kind of broader global industries of security technologies, or even things like the fact that, there's a commercial value that the prevent policy has. It's actually the research, the report, the kind of legislation itself is sold as a product to other governments. And I think that's really fascinating. And maybe it's not as explicit or tangible as, colonialism in the ways that we think about, one country physically dominating or militarily dominating another, even though we do see that also today. But there are also these other ways in which I think it produces the same, or indeed like stems from the same root that colonialism in general has. And so that was the reason I really wanted to trace that history, because I think it isn't necessarily useful to just say that Islamophobia sprang up after 9/11. When you kind of have that broader view, you're able to tie things together and make connections. Because I suppose the other thing to say is that, the narratives we see today around Muslims as threats, Muslims as patriarchal, etc., they all, you can see that same rhetoric in writing from the 17 and 1800s, and even to some degree earlier than that. So I really felt that that deserved time and space, because that, I feel, would help us in our resistance, in the sense that, we have to actually go deeper to the very roots of like where these ideologies stem from and why they are needed in the first place.
Oh, there's a huge amount to touch on there. I mean, I found, the point in the book where you said like prevent has almost been like trademarked and like sold as a product to other, countries, fascinating and disturbing. But
wild.
What you were saying there about like, how pseudosciences like phrenology have been out of fashion for a very long time, but the underpinning assumption of like innate racial characteristics seems very much still in evidence, in dominant sort of ideology of like white supremacy when it comes to Muslims and Islam.
Yeah. One thing that is just interesting to add to that point, because I do feel it kind of muddies the water when it comes to Islamophobia, is, people kind of feeling that, well, how can we talk about a racism when Muslims are a religious grouping? They're not a race. And so I think it is that really interesting way in which the language of race has sort of been re-articulated today instead as culture, or we talk about ideology. And I think when it comes to Muslims, you do see the interesting conflation of all those things. So, it's this idea that there's a Muslim culture, or there's a Muslim, or indeed religion, and that's the thing that marks Muslims as different. But in each case, if you look at the way it's actually spoken about, it does just re-articulate exactly that logic of racialization that you just said.
Well, we'll go into what you've touched on in terms of like prevent and counter extremism and all of that in a minute, maybe. But one thing that's obviously dominating the headlines at the moment is the situation in Ukraine. And I think, given that you wrote this Guardian piece a few weeks ago, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the reaction, I guess, in Britain to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the crisis that's inevitably followed. I saw like a figure today saying something like 4 million people have been displaced. And obviously we would all agree that refugees fleeing Ukraine should be welcomed into this country and indeed other countries without question or hindrance. But you made the interesting point in that Guardian piece that there's still this seam of Islamophobia that runs through the discourse around Ukraine, particularly when we compare it to like other wars and other refugee crises. Could you, say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sure people have seen on social media, different clips of the kind of language that's been used to exceptionalize what's happening in Ukraine. And there's been talk of, but this is a civilized country where this war is happening, or, these refugees, they're blonde and they're blue-eyed. And for these reasons, it's implied, we must humanize and we must kind of really take seriously the violence that's being inflicted. And I think that's where the problem comes in, because in an ideal world, I think we would have this same level of care and concern for every place that faces occupation or war, or where people are displaced. But I think what was really fascinating about watching not only the rhetoric that's developed, but the fact that, the government in the UK, for example, is able to offer £350 to people for housing refugees from Ukraine. I think it shows us a number of things, because not only is there that element of we can humanize this particular group of people, but I think that really reinforces the fact that Muslim people, and I suppose places associated with Muslim majority populations, are really seen, I think, to be naturally prone to violence. And for that reason, we don't really need to bring a lens of empathy. And interestingly, obviously, what that also does, it absolves Western intervention as a form of war, because I think in the case of Ukraine, we understand that the reason people are fleeing is that there is a perpetrator. The perpetrator is the Russian state. Whereas I think in the case of a lot of Muslim countries, the perpetrator is, the UK or America, or I suppose nation states that try to absolve themselves and not be portrayed as, tyrants or occupiers, but instead as, democratizers and liberators and civilizers. And so I think that becomes very clear through the discourses from Ukraine, but also just going back to what I was saying about, the way that lots of things that we kind of were told were impossible in terms of, we can't simply just let refugees into this country willy-nilly. We can't have an open border policy. And particularly when it comes to asylum seekers, there's a big conflation in the public imagination between Muslims and asylum seekers. And, I use a quote in the book from Michael Gove, who sort of talked about if we had open borders in Europe, it would be like hanging a sign welcoming terrorists into Europe. And I think that's fascinating because once you suddenly have a set of refugees who we can contextualize and who we understand that the causes of displacement are not of their own making or indeed deserved, we can suddenly understand that, border controls can be shifted. They aren't, innate and inevitable and necessary. And so there's also something in there to me that's kind of speaks to the undercurrent, I suppose, of this book, which is that, what's the alternative world we can imagine? And sometimes we're told, borders can't fall overnight. These things are simply too utopian, what you're asking for. And actually what we see in practice is that things can change overnight, actually, when the will is there and when the political, I suppose, conscience is able to be articulated in a way that's convenient for the establishment. So, I mean, there's more you could probably say about this crisis and what it's revealing right now, in terms of even people showing solidarity and not being criminalized for that. And if we compare that to protests that we saw last year around what was happening in Palestine, people were going into school with Palestinian flags and being reported to prevent. And, today you have schools encouraging children to donate or raise money for Ukraine. And ostensibly, these are both cases of occupation. These are both cases of people being persecuted in war. So it's really interesting, the kind of double standards, I suppose, that are thrown up. And those double standards are linked exactly to that discourse of colonialism and white supremacy that we just spoke about.
Yeah. You've mentioned prevent there. It'd be good to talk a bit about that because many of our listeners of this show aren't actually based in Britain, about half at last count. So they may not be that familiar with prevent. Could you say a little bit about what it is, when it was introduced, or kind of what it emerged out of and the impact it's had?
Definitely. And I think this is actually important for people across the world because, like I said earlier, prevent is the basis on which many countering violent extremism policies across the world are based on. So in the early 2000s, you kind of have the government in the UK establishing its counter-terrorism policy, and a part of the plans included how to counter non-violent extremism. So there was this idea that actually prior to violence being enacted, there must be a way that we can preempt it. We can preempt it even happening. So that really requires the policing of non-violent behaviors. And so this became known as prevent. That's what it's called now. And it was a policy in the early days that was really just encouraging people to kind of look out for signs that were very ambiguous that they may see, say, particularly in young people, in community groups. And, from the very start, the way it was determined where the funding would be put was that it was based on local authorities with the highest concentrations of Muslim populations. So you see from the start that there's this direct correlation in the kind of logic of the policy that Muslims need to be monitored basically for signs that they might be violent in the future. And so it's a preemptive, racializing, criminalizing policy. But what's really kind of brought it to the fore in conversations in the UK is that in 2015, you then have this piece of policy actually become legislation. And what that does is it makes every public sector worker, so that's like 500,000 people in the UK, legally obliged now to look out for signs of radicalization amongst those that they work with. So that includes, teachers monitoring students, doctors monitoring patients, if you're a librarian, if you're a counselor, if you're a policeman, like in all these roles that fall under public sector, you're being asked to surveil on behalf of the state. And the thing that's really important about this policy is that the signs of radicalization come out of a report that has been classified by the government. It's a single study. It's never been peer reviewed. And so you have hundreds of academics who, have condemned this as completely unscientific, a policy that is based on something that you wouldn't even base a research paper on. It's like really, really problematic. But more than that, because the signs that come out of that report are so vague and ambiguous, in a way you would assume that anybody could end up being reported to Prevent, because signs include, for example, questioning your identity, if someone's acting withdrawn or isolated, if they're, changing friendship groups. And those are things that I think every single person listening to this podcast has probably exhibited at some point or another. But what's interesting is that a lot of research shows that where there's the broadest kind of discretion in the application of a law, you actually see the most racialized application, because what happens is that people are being basically asked to kind of obey the racial profiling that comes from the broader narrative. So where for 20 years, radicalization and terrorism have only been associated with Muslims in the public imagination, when you ask people to look out for signs of radicalization, they're automatically being encouraged, implicitly to look in certain people. And so that's why you have, the majority of those reported to Prevent are Muslims, but even more interestingly, are children. It turns out that the majority of people being reported to Prevent are under the age of 18, which is really wild if you think about the fact that this is supposedly about stopping violence, because, how many perpetrators of violence have been, 6 or 7-year-olds, how many of them have been at school. So in a way, the critique of Prevent is like endless, because even on its own terms, it fails. We've even seen people who went through the de-radicalization scheme that Prevent offers, which is Channel, and still come out the other side and enact violence. So you kind of have, on its own terms, it fails. But then even by our terms, I think, as people who, are critical and, anti-racist, it also fails because, just to give, I guess, another angle of critique, 90% of those who are referred to Prevent don't end up being put onto that de-radicalization scheme, and instead they're signposted to mental health services, social care, other kinds of educational support. And what you see from that is then, well, people are being criminalized based just on vulnerabilities. Should you have to go through a home office, a police scheme or institution simply because you're vulnerable? Probably not. There should be other systems that can kind of take care. And I think in a way it actually reflects the fact that there's been such cuts to social funding and to kind of the resources and support that actually would nourish people and help people. And instead what you have now is this very coercive system where not only are people criminalized for their vulnerabilities, but also if you look at some of the signs that crop up in different institutions, they include things like if somebody's critiquing Prevent, that itself is a sign of radicalization. If somebody's raising questions about wars in the Middle East, that could be a sign of radicalization. So you then see that there's also this very political angle where it's discouraging, essentially, dissent. And this doesn't only affect Muslims. And I think the potential of it is that this affects everybody. And we've even seen in recent years that some of the signs or ideas that are listed as potentially extremist or signs of future violence include things like, the other year there was a leak of a piece of advice, I think, from police to teachers that included Extinction Rebellion, that included anti-capitalism. So, if you have environmental activism and you have anti-capitalism itself being seen as these are signs of radicalization, these are signs that people are going to perpetrate violence in the future, you're essentially narrowing the field of like anything that can be articulated by people and them not be criminalized. So it's a really coercive situation. And I think, and again, for people across the world, this Prevent policy is sold to governments. The USA's entire CV policy is based entirely on Prevent. And it's, being used in aid projects. It's being used in China as an aid project. And we know that in China, the Uyghur Muslim population are facing, a genocide by some people's standards. So I think that it's definitely not just a British issue. This is something that's global and very deliberately so. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, it has commercial value. So it's profitable, it's unscientific, it's racist. And even human rights organizations like Amnesty, so mainstream, they've said that this is a complete violation of people's rights. And yet the government continues with it and in fact are attempting to reinforce it and reform it.
Yeah, I mean, it was, ridiculous reading in the book how one of the risk factors in young people referred to perceiving religious or racial harassment,
right?
Which seems both like gaslighting and a tautology, because it's, I don't know, yeah. I mean, one thing you mentioned there about how this kind of pre-criminalization of people, and what impact is all of this having then on you talk about how there isn't this kind of wealth of examples of groups resisting Islamophobia because to try and organize resistance to something systemic like this is often effectively criminalized, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point because when, in doing the research for the book, that was something that, is really, a really important part of this series, I think, is including examples where, people are doing that really important organization and work. And I think a lot of the books are geared towards resistance. And this one obviously is as well. But what was interesting was that finding examples of organized resistance to Islamophobia are difficult exactly because of just the reach of counter extremism in the UK. And I think that makes it really difficult for there to be organized resistance, because immediately, if you're kind of vocalizing that what we stand for is, opposing the government's legislation on terrorism or its legislation on extremism, you're already going to fall into the category of, well, hang on, doesn't that make you an extremist? That sets off those bells of radicalization. So one of the examples I do use is the NGO Cage. And, this is an organization who, by the media establishment and the political establishment, are derided as, terrorist sympathizers, extremist aligned. And I think that tells you a lot that, where you do have Muslims at the forefront of organizations that are attempting to support those who are affected by war on terror legislation and counter-terror legislation, they're already on the back foot, because that puts you in the position of, being deemed suspicious yourself. So it's a very coercive climate. And I think it's why we sort of need to really be building intersectional connections when it comes to Islamophobia, because ultimately, this isn't only going to affect Muslims. And already we've seen a lot of this kind of counter-extremism and even counter-terrorism legislation used against other types of activists. You even think about the Stansted 15 and the fact that their charges when they were trying to stop a deportation flight were terrorism-based charges. And I think what you start to see is that really anything can be called terrorism or can be called extremism where it doesn't suit the government. And I think that's a scary future to think about, where activism is just being completely coerced. And through the counter-extremism agenda as well, just to add, even critical thinking itself is kind of coerced. That there's no spaces where young people can really raise these questions without being, having to police themselves or feeling that they can't really voice these thoughts and opinions. And that's to me, that's effectively a police state. That's such high levels of surveillance that it's not about, CCTV cameras and wires. It's really about everybody being the eyes and ears of the state. And that's something that the police say themselves with a lot of pride, that, that's what we want. We want everybody to be the eyes and ears of the police on the ground. But that's obviously like a really draconian situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'd be good to maybe talk a little bit about the recent history of anti-terror legislation, because I mean, as you say, like one example of counter-terrorism policing powers, stop and search. I think your statistic in the book is that 0.007% of stops lead to terrorism convictions, despite, this increasingly broad definition of the term. So if you accept the state's claim that these kind of laws or powers are aiming to prosecute terrorists, then they're failing dismally on their own terms.
Exactly.
So if it's not really about crime prevention, then what is the sort of the unstated intent? Yeah, could you say a bit about how we're seeing this creep, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in the case that you just mentioned, that's particularly to do with people being stopped at borders coming in and out of the UK. So terrorism legislation, there's just like loads of pieces of legislation. It's kind of a long list. But I think to sort of say broadly, I think the key points about it are that terrorism, as you just mentioned, is defined so vaguely that so many things that I think ordinary people, when we think about counterterrorism, we'd assume that sounds like a good thing, right? Like what we assume to be terrorism is violence, and particularly acts of violence that affect everyday random people. But in truth, counterterrorism isn't really dealing with that. And, one of the main routes that people end up being criminalized or convicted, through counterterrorism laws is usually for what's called preparatory acts for terrorism. And obviously that again sounds like, people stockpiling explosives or something like that. But in reality, this is where people are convicted for usually to do with literature that they either have downloaded onto their laptop, that they've read, or even that they've written. And so I think people would be surprised to know that the majority of people convicted on terrorism-related charges in UK prisons are there because of something that they read or something that they downloaded or that they wrote. And, you have lawyers calling this terrorism by negligence. This is like people who just have no idea that they would even have fallen under such legislation. And then, as you said, you've got this just mass stopping of people. And I remember at one point I actually looked up, and I didn't include it in the book, but 0.007 as a percentage, you actually have more likelihood that you and the two officers who stop you at the border all share the same birthday than you do of being convicted under this. Yeah, and I just think that's, a really, really puts it in perspective. But as you said, then what is the purpose? This clearly isn't stopping any kind of violence. But what I would say it does do is it enforces, again, self-surveillance, like with Prevent, in the sense that when, just taking that Schedule 7 example, when you go to the airport as a Muslim, knowing that the chance is so high that you are going to be stopped, and also being aware that anything really could be a sign of suspicion, I think it enforces wider self-surveillance. So, being careful about what do you read? Should I download this onto my laptop? Should I not? Should I talk about this? Should I not? And in conjunction with that, you have reported cases of entrapment, right? Where people haven't done anything that falls under the very broad banner of kind of a terrorism related offense, but then actually you have operatives of the state entrapping them. So there's a case I use in the book of a man who ran an Islamic bookstall in Manchester, and in the case where he's convicted, the judge actually says, it's a really difficult case to convict because there was no blueprint, there was no plan of action. And in fact, the evidence against him was that he was approached by two undercover operatives who asked him a set of leading questions, and the answers that he gave were then able to be categorized under one of these kind of vague, broad terrorism charges. So realistically, I think this is just a case of social control. Is about the state being able to deter people from any type of political activism. And obviously it falls particularly hard on Muslims in the sense that we're racially profiled through it. But also, that again is once you have built an apparatus like that, it can be operated at any time against anybody. And I think that's what's really fascinating about this, that I think a lot of terrorism and counterterrorism charges are accepted broadly by the wider population because we sort of just assume that it sounds like a good thing, counterterrorism. It has the kind of the moral argument in the name. But in reality, when we look at it, even Supreme Court judges have said that the definition of terrorism is so broad in the UK in particular that I say in the book, showing solidarity with the Stansted 15 technically could have got you to be seen as supporting a terrorist organization or a set of terrorists. And I think that's like, yeah, it's really hard to kind of even convey the seriousness of that. At first, you almost have to undo and prove that the moral ground is not with national security legislation, and then you have to kind of make the case. So it's difficult. I think you're already on the back foot when we're talking about these things, but when you sort of break it down, I think you can see it's very much a surveillance state.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you say in the book how obviously historically there's always been a domestic kind of police force, and a lot of what we're seeing now with counter-terrorism policing domestically, has always been around, but it was just in Britain's colonies and so on, and we think it's this new phenomenon, but it really isn't.
Well, yeah, because what was interesting when I was reading some of the research into terrorism laws was that there was sometimes talked about as, this has set up a parallel criminal justice system in the UK, because a lot of what terrorism laws also do, I suppose it's worth saying, are they make exceptions to other laws. So, where usually you can't stop and search without suspicion, under terrorism legislation, you don't have to have reasonable suspicion. Or where you can't detain without charge for more than 48 hours, actually under terrorism legislation, you can. So there are all these exceptions that are made. What's interesting when I kept hearing that language around it's a parallel criminal justice system was that, well, actually there's always been one rule in the colonies and one rule at home. And I think when you start having people from former colonies in this country, then you see that a lot of the language used in policing, in the 70s and the 80s, when you have like Brixton riots, Toxteth riots, it is bringing that language of social control and counterinsurgency right into the heart of Britain and British cities. And kind of that's all from the beginning. That conversation is because of the racialized nature of the people that it's being associated with. And you even, there's a quote I think I use in the book that where you even have the chief of police in the 80s kind of saying, what we actually need to do is police for the sake of social control. It isn't actually about the stated aims of, keeping people safe. This is now just about controlling populations. And that is just a colonial tactic. So again, I think a connection we see with colonialism.
Yeah. I think you gave an interview with Galdem recently where you explained why you used inverted commas around the words terrorist and terrorism throughout the book. And I thought that was, very interesting and on point. And I suppose you could extend that to words like security as well, because if we unquestioningly just absorb and regurgitate these terms, they are ideological, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I think that, sometimes having those kind of conversations about language can seem really abstract and like, what's that got to do with reality? But the point that I tried to make throughout the book is that these ideological narratives have really direct material consequences on people's lives. And so to me, it is actually really powerful. And I invite everyone who reads the book, and I'll invite everyone who's listening to this podcast now, that if we all stopped referring to Muslim perpetrators of violence as terrorists and instead just called, that's a Muslim perpetrator of violence, or a Muslim person who has perpetrated an act of violence, and if we stopped referring to the state's violence as security, but instead talked about, the brutalization, the kidnapping, the detention, the kind of coercion of people, what does even just changing our language then do to shift that broader narrative? And how does shifting that broader narrative change then how we think about the application of just the very simple logics of, suspicion or looking out for signs of radicalization and that kind of thing? So I think that, yeah, for me, it's the fact that these ideological narratives have really serious consequences on people. And I use testimonies throughout the book where I think you can see that and see how this isn't something abstract. This is something that really affects people's mental health, physical health, family lives. That's really important to me. And I think that if any of us kind of have any empathy or care about people, that's something that matters to all of us.
I'd like to talk a little bit about, some of these impacts on the life of Muslims in Britain, I guess. The constant feeling that you're kind of being, Islamic ideology is being linked to violence and terrorism as something inherent within it. And then you kind of get that liberal sort of flip side to that coin, I guess, where, Muslims who are perpetrating acts of violence are somehow not representative of, the true or the real sort of Islam, that it's a misinterpretation of the Quran or something. Yeah, could you say a bit more about that liberal defense that is quite common?
No, I'm really glad that you raised that, because I think, it's actually Aaron Kanani who I think says it so well, that, whether it's that you say all Muslims are terrorists, or you say, oh, no, it's just a minority who've misunderstood it. In either case, the kind of outcome of either of those logics is that, well, all Muslims need to be surveilled, because any one of them could be either a member of that minority, or could be, one of the people who've misinterpreted, quote unquote. And I think also what's interesting with that liberal narrative is that it often comes from a wider discourse of kind of secularism, wherein there's this idea that religion is something that should be separated from the state, and indeed that it is. But actually what you see through that narrative is this strange simultaneous sort of intervention into what religion is, what is the authentic Islam, what's the kind of right interpretation of Islam. And you have this really confusing and slippery notion of okay, well, is an act of violence Islamically motivated if the person says that it is, or is it about us saying that they're Muslim? Are you Muslim enough for it to be Islamically motivated? And if we don't, Talal Assad talks about this really interesting thing of you simultaneously have this idea that simply reading the Quran is like a sign of radicalization, because they're just so, motivated to follow this text unthinkingly. And at the same time, you have the idea that people misinterpret it. So actually, it's all about the interpretation. It's all about how people are reading it. And in either case, the point he's making is that how do we determine what violence is religiously motivated and what violence is not religiously motivated? And in either case, how does that then matter when it comes to convicting or criminalizing or sentencing people on the basis of it? And why I think that matters is that he sort of reveals, or to me what that reveals is that when we're talking about any type of violence as religiously motivated, what that language I think actually does is aim to depoliticize the violence, because we assume that religion is something kind of difficult to talk about, kind of complicated. And also I think, within the context we live in, it's, if you adhere to religion, you're really adhering to an epistemology that is outside of Western modernity. And, it's not really deemed to be intelligible, I suppose. And so what's interesting with that then is that even where the majority of, and all intelligence services say this, the majority of Muslim perpetrators of violence have always vocalized and articulated their motives as political. So, they'll say that there are geopolitical motives usually. Maybe it's in vindictive terms, but it'll often be talking about particular acts of the US government or the British government or particular kind of grievances. And then they'll talk about this violence as being in response to that. But even where that's articulated as direct political motives, even where intelligence services have again and again said this, using the language of religion and using this idea of, misinterpretation, interpretation, minority of Muslims and whatever else, it really just clouds and obscures that conversation. And I think what's crucial about that is then that we never have the really important conversation, which I think we should be having around, if we really want to prevent quote unquote violence, then we need to address those political questions, and we need to think about what's causing and motivating violence. And if individual non-state actors claim again and again that they're responding to state violence, state sanctioned violence, whether that's global or local, then isn't that maybe one of the best routes to addressing, those individual acts of violence, to actually redress foreign policy? And after 7/7, you have really interesting set of conversations that the government has with Muslim organizations, Muslim representatives, and again what a lot of these people say is that foreign policy is really at the root of this. Like, we probably need to address Britain's foreign policy, and that's the one thing that the British government are unwilling to do. And so instead they ramp up prevent, and they say, no, we just need to criminalize and preempt violence, and kind of say that the violence just stems from something innate in Muslims. So sorry, I've taken your question sort of a different direction, I think, than you intended, but I sort of, that those are the things that I think are really disguised almost by that liberal narrative. I think the reason that liberal narrative is seen as helpful is that it's quote unquote kind, right? It's like morally, it's benign. It's like, Muslims are not to blame. We can't just, they're good as well. They do nice things. And I think that's so, again, so it's such a diversion. It really does nothing to deal with the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, mentioning Aaron Kundnani, I think you say in the text how he's right to suggest the only political act Muslims can perform without suspicion is rejection of their Muslim identity. And there's, we're all familiar with like the good immigrant, bad immigrant dichotomy, and I suppose that operates transposed over into like the good Muslim and the bad Muslim context.
Well, exactly. Yeah. In a way, one of the things I wanted to talk about in the book was the direct impact on Muslims in terms of how you can be Muslim, because that's something that is really curtailed when there's this idea that, being overly religious, whether that's in the way that you're read or, like if you see somebody praying, we automatically imagine that that is actually also a sign that they kind of have a higher propensity or chance of being violent. And so in that sense, I think Muslims have to perform, the good Muslim, and that often includes, condemning acts of violence again and again and again. But it also includes things like, I talk in the book, I don't know actually if I do, but one of the things I was thinking about when I was writing the book was that a lot of conversations even that Muslims have amongst ourselves include things like, can we prove the contribution that Muslims have made to maths and science, right? And this real kind of feeling that if Muslims can just prove that Islam is actually, has made contributions to modernity, that it is a source of good. You used to have this narrative that was really predominant about Islam means peace, and you'd hear this slogan everywhere, Islam means peace. And, in the Arabic, Islam does not mean peace to start with. But secondly, it was so interesting to me that we could only define Islam in relation to the violence that was assumed to be its defining feature. And I think that says a lot about the performance, basically, that Muslims are expected to do. And I think that's really troubling because, again, a lot of these narratives and discourses and states that produce them claim to be secular and claim that that means that they make no interventions in religion. But then you have, to give a really key example, the French government, who, are ardent that they are a secular government and that religion has no place in public life. But at the same time, last year or the year before, the French government produced this Republican Charter of Values that they asked all Muslim organizations to sign up to. But this charter is not, neutral. This is a charter that kind of says, critique of the state is treachery, essentially, like really using this language of kind of like betrayal, Muslims as a fifth column, and if their religion compels them to critique the state, then that is actually not okay. And so, that's an intervention into people's faith and the manifestation of their religious beliefs in their kind of political thinking. But obviously it's not seen as that. And so I think that, that question of kind of the only acceptable Muslim being one who doesn't exhibit kind of adherence to Islam, I think we see also in the phenomenon of ex-Muslims. You don't have this phenomenon with any other religion or group of people where they're defined by something that they're not. And instead you have this platforming, though, of lots of people who, have written, really profitable books about their experience being Muslim. And it's essentially, a whistleblowing kind of performance where it's like, as someone who was Muslim, I can confirm how barbaric they are, how patriarchal they are. And, all that does is justify and reinforce, all the policies, whether at borders, domestically or internationally, that are Islamophobic. And I think that they're a really good example of the fact that actually the kind of best or, most celebrated Muslims in the West are those who are really willing to just comply with Islamophobic narratives. And you even see that really early on in the war on terror. You have RAND, a military think tank in the US, who produced this report kind of basically saying in quite clear terms that we need to fund and support Muslim organizations and groups who can produce what they call a quote unquote moderate version of Islam, but which they expand on, meaning a version that will be okay with our foreign policy goals. And so you see this constant kind of hope to shape and intervene in what is acceptable what the acceptable Muslim is and isn't. And, as a practicing Muslim writing this book, that was something that was really serious to me too, because for me, writing this book was also, a manifestation of my faith. It's like, I believe it's important to speak about justice. I believe it's important to reveal injustices. And actually, when that's being intervened on and when that's being policed, essentially, that's really troubling. But it's not always seen as troubling because religion in of itself is troubling to the Western imaginary in a lot of ways. So that was something I wanted to also just explore. And it was, probably my favorite part of exploring in the book, to be honest, because it's something I don't think we do talk about a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to say, one of the sections I found in the book that was most interesting was when you talk about secularism, because I hadn't really considered it before.
Yeah.
And you write how it's, and I'm quoting, often assumed as an inherently objective way of viewing the world and religion as its inverse. But secularism is born from a specific history and entangled in the project of constructing European white supremacy. Secular does not mean neutral. Do you want to say just a bit more about the history and the function of secularism? Because I thought it was really fascinating.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, it's the same for me. It's not something I had previously really questioned, but it's something I got thinking about just on a personal level when I'd be invited to talk about Islamophobia in, anti-racist spaces and spaces on the left. And people, I think, were really willing to engage with the idea of Muslims, as racialized subjects. But then I would always sense a bit of unease, let's say, when I would kind of say, is there somewhere I can pray or something like that? And I began to think about the way in which actually, adherence to religiosity is still something that I think we're a bit squeamish about. We definitely see it as, to some degree, it's unmodern, it's backwards, it's embarrassing. It's like, how can you be intelligent and religious? And I think that I just wanted to dwell with that thought for a moment, because if you really explore that, that is still a manifestation of that colonial association of, religious others with being backwards, barbaric, unintelligent, lesser. And so that kind of led me on the journey then to explore, well, where does this idea of secularism come from? And what was fascinating was that it is stemming from the same discourses which are producing the idea of race and that are racializing people. And some of the really interesting quotes that I came across were where, because it's confusing in the West, because really what you have is Europe at the same time as it's kind of stating that what makes it superior is its secularism, its privatization of religion, its neutrality of public space. At the same time as doing that, it's also sending Christian missionaries abroad to do a lot of the kind of soft colonialism, let's say. And at the same time, it's saying that one of the things that makes Europe so advanced is its Christianity. So there's a lot of like confusion and conflation. And I think in the UK, you see that very clearly, where the church and the state are so symbolically joined, and both things are seen to be what makes Britain so great and so superior in values. So there's those elements. And, a quote that I just wanted to mention is that, so I speak about this guy called Lord Cromer, who was, a colonizer, kind of involved in different colonies, but particularly Egypt. And in his writings, he talks about the fact that even Christianity has stagnated in the Orient, by his language, because it's been surrounded by forces that are against progression, or that limit progression. And so there, I think, for the first time is where, at least in the book, from the examples that I use, where you see that there's this racialization of religion, that religion in the West can modernize, can secularize, can become kind of congruent with modernity. And you see that with the way that Christianity is talked about today in Britain, for example, that, that's okay, it fits in. But actually, there's then this racialization of religion that if it's from the Orient, if it's kind of practiced in XYZ way, then actually it's still backwards. It needs to be modernized. And there's some really interesting conversations I had that I fed into the book as well, around kind of people whose research is on secularism, on kind of how the idea of civilizing populations is also in parallel with the idea of, secularizing populations to kind of bring them into modernity. And I think you see that then with the way that there's a lot of emphasis on kind of, why do Muslims need to be so publicly Muslim? Can't this just be a matter of private conscience? Ideally, couldn't Muslims secularize Islam? And that would be the way for them to enter modernity. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of focus as well on things like hijab and things on like, public demonstrations of faith. And, if you think about France in particular, obviously that's a huge issue, but even a lot of hijab and niqab bans across Europe, there's this idea that the reason we're banning this is because we're secular states and we're uncomfortable with public manifestations of religiosity. But actually, the way that those pieces of legislation land are that they just directly target Muslim women in particular. And I think that's really interesting, because it's like, through this language of neutrality, liberal values, and objectivity, you're basically justifying the discrimination against one particular group, and you're still doing it on the basis that their beliefs are backwards and their way of living is incongruent with Europe, and doesn't fit. And so I think for me that was like really important to explore, because it is still a manifestation of those discourses. And I think I kind of feel, even because there's a lot of conversations obviously these days about decolonizing, knowledge, or decolonizing many different things, but secularism is like the last bastion of that conversation, the kind of thing that's left standing, because we don't really critique or question its colonial roots or connections. Not to say that it is a monolith either, right? Like that I think that's the question I'm trying to raise, is what even is secularism? Yeah, it was something really important for me to explore.
I mean, there's a few things I'd like to touch on kind of off the back of that, I guess. Firstly, I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will have also listened to the serial podcast, The Trojan Horse Affair. I mean, what you're saying about church involvement in cultural life, including education, is completely normalized. And yet when an Islamic influence in schools is perceived, that's cause for alarm, because, Islam is seen as something foreign or un-British in some way. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the podcast, which has got to be, one of the most listened to, talked about podcasts out there at the moment. Could you say a bit more about, the Trojan Horse Affair and what it reveals about how Islamophobia operates in this country?
Yeah. I mean, so for listeners who don't know, I guess, the Trojan Horse Affair in the UK was this case where there was a fake letter, a phony letter sent to the local council in Birmingham in the UK, kind of alleging that schools in Birmingham are being Islamized. There are these Muslim teachers and governors who are basically radicalizing or Islamizing, whatever this meant, because the language is ambiguous as well, but in a way that is kind of inappropriate for schools to do. And as the Trojan Horse podcast really, brilliantly explores, this is all a massive hoax, and yet the entire kind of political and media establishment are willing to go along with it. And on the back of that, you see new counter-extremism policies come into place, huge scrutiny on schools, on Muslim majority local authorities, and all the rest of it. But I suppose to link it to the conversation that we're just having here, one of the interesting things is that when they interviewed the governors and the teachers, they did nothing that was against kind of educational standards. And in fact, as far as I recall, within educational policy in the UK, having a religious assembly at the start of the day, or kind of adhering to the religion of the majority of pupils, is part and parcel of school life in the UK. And I remember going to school and we sing Christian hymns every morning, Christmas, Easter, like you do all the things, and that's within a state that kind of professes to not be attached to the church. And so in the schools in Birmingham, all they had done was say, oh well, the majority of our pupils are Muslim, wouldn't it be kind of empowering for them to see that reflected in the curricula? And so they simply replaced a lot of those things with the Muslim equivalent. So let's have a conversation about Islam, or let's have a call to prayer, and space to pray. But that obviously, because of the war on terror narrative and everything we've discussed today, then becomes associated with, well, this is radicalizing, well, this is dangerous, this is akin to encouraging violence amongst children. And so I think that is a really good example, actually. I'm really glad you brought that up, of that kind of double standard that's applied. And I don't think it's about, again, bad intentions. This is simply like a very structural and deeply rooted narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's part of this parallel lives thesis that you talk about, the idea that Muslimness is sort of at odds with Britishness, whatever that means, and therefore a cause of concern or alarm. It would be good to talk a little bit about how all of this also ties up with questions around gender and feminism and sexuality. I mean, you mentioned like bans on the niqab and stuff, ostensibly on the grounds that it's liberatory for women, but without really any reference to what the women impacted by that want, or the consequences of it for them, in terms of, there seems to be this perverse outcome, right? Often where, I think you mentioned in the book how it results in a further withdrawal of women who have been affected from public life.
Yeah. It links to everything we've already said, in the sense that, again, these are narratives you see in the 1800s, 1700s, and again, these are narratives that justify a lot of intervention, because you have this idea that Muslim men oppress Muslim women, whether that's clothes that they wear or that's through anything else. And so, it's only the civilizing, secularizing West that can really save them. And we see that directly today. And I think, the legislative bans are a really interesting example, because whilst they profess to be kind of, upholding certain values or saving Muslim women from their religion, Absolutely, they push people out of public life. But even if you're not directly affected, let's say there's a niqab ban, not a lot of women necessarily wear niqab, but even if you're just a Muslim woman then who's visibly Muslim in other ways, you then are so hyper visible because you're the topic of, public debate. Your existence in the public sphere is a topic of public debate. And obviously this, is very much a contradiction of a lot of liberal feminist narratives around bodily autonomy. If there was any other piece of legislation kind of demarcating what women can and can't wear, I think there'd be a lot of outcry. But when it comes to Muslim women, because we assume that this is the decent, respectable thing to do, people might even remember some images that circulated, was it like 2017, I think, of, a Muslim woman at the beach in France, and she's surrounded by armed policemen who are, asking her essentially to take off her clothes because she's too covered at the beach. And I just think that's like wild that, you can be a security concern, or you can be, I don't know, deemed so problematic through the clothes that you wear, when at the same time one of the kind of liberal feminist tenets is that choosing the clothes that you put on your own body is, a kind of right that any autonomous person should have. So there's all of those kind of elements. But I guess the other thing I wanted to bring in when it comes to thinking about that is that those kind of legislative bans are also within the continuum of other ways that Muslim women are kind of experience the sharp end of being hyper visible, I suppose. And what I mean is that whilst it isn't necessarily at any point stated that something like counter extremism or prevent should directly target Muslim women in any specific way, the ways that it manifests is that, Muslim women who wear hijab or niqab are so associated with Islam, are probably the most overrepresented image of Islam, that I think we are then hyper visible in all these places. And one of the testimonies that I use in the book comes from a woman who was talking about when she was getting mental health therapy on the NHS. She wears a niqab, and the way that immediately that was read as the source of all of her troubles, and that she wasn't even able to be heard on her own terms. And so, by virtue of being a Muslim woman, your access to healthcare, to social care, to mental health care is already undermined in some ways because of the ways that you're made hyper visible. And this also translates into the classroom. Muslim women who are students, let's say, again, if they're read as Muslim women, the ways that kind of automatically heightens the scrutiny on what they say and what they don't say. And obviously we had the case of Shamima Begum in the UK, who was stripped of her citizenship despite having been a child when she left this country. And, again, had she been a white girl, I'm sure we would have talked about grooming here. We would have talked about the fact that, she was groomed, manipulated, experienced statutory rape, if you think about the fact she was 15. But none of this language is used to talk about kind of the sexual or gendered violence that she experienced. Instead, because she went to join ISIS as a 15-year-old, she is the threat. She's the one who loses her citizenship. And even just the public debates around that, the imagery around the way she's represented, all of that also then has impacts on visibly Muslim women in the UK, because that image is transposed onto us. And so there's the heightened scrutiny on young schoolgirls in Bethnal Green, in East London, in the area where Shamima Begum was from. Are they also prone to becoming radicalized in the way that she was, rather than saying, actually, let's not strip her of her citizenship. She is a product of the conditions in which she grew up in. I think stripping her of her citizenship is a fascinating way of distancing British society's collusion in and real kind of conditioning of her to then go and join ISIS, because instead we should be saying, actually, she's just a girl who grew up in London. So what is it about growing up in London as a girl of color that can create so much isolation, that can lead you to feel so or be so vulnerable to being groomed? And I think they're the questions that we don't ask, because they're the difficult ones, and they're the ones that essentially shine a light on the context in this country. But gender is really important to think about when we think about Islamophobia, because Muslim women are so specifically harmed by Islamophobic narratives. And even if we just go back to the very beginning of our conversation, when it comes to hate crimes, these very visible verbal or physical attacks, it is Muslim women who are disproportionately harmed. And yet we never talk about that as assault in the way that I think we would talk about sexual assault, even though if someone's clothing is being removed in public by a perpetrator, whether that's a headscarf or anything else, that's a form of sexual assault. But we never talk about these women as kind of victims of sexual assault, because it's just like, oh, it's just, some Muslim woman who's been attacked because of Brexit. And I think about Muslim women's experiences really reveals a lot of contradictions in a lot of the application of liberal feminist values. And if we really wanted to center women's rights or kind of a liberatory politic for women, I think looking at Muslim women's experiences of those double standards is a really useful place to start, because there's so much that we're unable to access in terms of safety or support just by virtue of being Muslim. And another example, and I'll end on this one, I know I'm kind of going down a tangent here, but, thinking about Muslim women who might actually experience, whether it's domestic violence or kind of any of the things that I think we're all assumed to experience at the hands of Muslim men. But say you do, let's just say for a second that there's a Muslim woman who does experience domestic violence at the hands of a partner. Is she supposed to call on state services to intervene in her family when they're also going to deem her, is she a threat? Is she radicalizing her children? Is she a source of suspicion herself? And in lots of cases, the laws, again, that have come out of terrorism cases have been expanded into even family courts. And that includes people having their children removed on the basis that they're deemed to be radicalizing them. And even if that doesn't happen, the perception of the feeling that that could happen, I think, makes people really unwilling and fearful to draw on state services. And so, in the same way that lots of undocumented women, and again, they'll be disproportionately Muslim as well, can't call on state services when it comes to interpersonal violence, Muslim women, I think, are a really useful place for us to start when we want to think about what actually would make women safer in general. And I use that example because I think it shows also how the state colludes with the types of patriarchal violence that sometimes it says that it opposes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what came through reading that whole section of the book and hearing you talk now is, the violence that Muslim women face is usually only viewed as important when it can be attributed to sort of Muslim men and Islam in some way.
Right.
And actually, the state sort of purports to care, but usually on an instrumental sort of basis. And I suppose, we could broaden that out then, to, this instrumentalizing of women to further an Islamophobic agenda. You can also see that at play in the way that LGBTQ plus rights are used for sort of nationalist and racist ends as well. I think you use the phrase homo-nationalism as how these kind of rights are used as a mirror to reflect or to further certain agendas.
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing in the sense that I think the British state or, many European states or Western states kind of profess that queer rights are really central to their agendas. But at the same time, if you look at the legislation, if you look at, things like border controls, and they have like really specific types of harm that affect, queer asylum seekers. And what's interesting, though, is that in the narrative that these states produce, they only associate immigrants and Muslims in particular with homophobia. And I think, I talk in the book about how there was this particular case in the UK where, again, it was focused on Birmingham and schools there. And I think it was because it evoked the Trojan Horse scandal. There was this association of those people as being, exceptionally patriarchal, exceptionally homophobic, exceptionally violent and backwards. But in actuality, lots of LGBTQ groups, organizations, and individuals saying that, this is just a dog whistle racism, like the idea that the only homophobia in society comes from Muslims is a really racist deflection of the fact that the state institutes and upholds the violation of queer people's rights, like I just said, at the border or in any number of other places. So again, I think it's a way that Muslims are used to, that Islamophobia is used to distract, divert, and really help the state to not ever be put under scrutiny or held accountable for violence that exists. Instead, we kind of say that Muslims are the source of all violence, and particularly violence that's kind of seen as antithetical to liberal values. And in that sense, you can then justify, then let's stop them coming into this country. They're bringing patriarchy with them. They're bringing homophobia with them. They're bringing whatever else it is with them. And so it's a very standard kind of Orientalist narrative of the other who is the opposite to the self. And on that basis, we can just kind of justify any number of things that we can say are linked to protecting our values, our rights. And you have that at the moment with the British values kind of agenda, this idea that there's a set of values that are unique to Britain, that are uniquely liberal, uniquely liberating, and that Muslims are an inherent threat to them. So it's everywhere. I kind of feel like there's, you could pick any discourse that is kind of normalized or commonsensical and see the ways that it really does interconnect with Islamophobia.
We've discussed it already, but let's make it explicit. Who are the main beneficiaries then of the production of Islamophobic narratives if, as you kind of have articulated, not just Muslims, but all of us are kind of, threatened by Islamophobia?
Yeah.
So who benefits?
Yeah, I think, if I say two broad categories, I would say states who do not want to have dissent. So, you see that across the West where, like, as we've just explained, lots of these counter-terrorism, counter-extremism laws basically just dissuade and criminalize protest, criminalize, direct actions, activism. But also you see lots of Muslim majority states across the world also taking on the benefits of counter-terror legislation, right? Because in a Muslim majority country, you can say, well, hey, any number of our population are terrorists. You've got protesters just say, well, they're probably extremist aligned. And because of the kind of broader Islamophobic discourse that you can tap into, then that kind of makes your coercive policies also acceptable by the West standards. So I think it does a lot for states who want to coerce and control populations and kind of up their draconian control. And then that also works hand in hand, I think, with the second group of beneficiaries who I would categorize as corporations, basically. And one avenue that I try to pick up on, which I think is under kind of looked at really, is news corporations, because I think we forget that news corporations are businesses. And so the production of Islamophobic narratives in the media isn't simply because of a kind of mean trend, but actually because it's really profitable. But secondarily, because of both those things, states and the media, the narratives that they produce, whether that's through policy or it's through kind of imagery or headlines, also really benefit the big money makers who are security industry. So whether that's, some of the examples I use in the book is like G4S, right? Not only do they run some of the detention centers and prisons in the UK, but they also work in defending kind of imperialist pillaging in places like Iraq, where you have military contracting with companies like that. And then you also have them kind of involved in, yeah, as I just mentioned, deportation of people, again, on the basis of Islamophobic narratives. You have arms companies who are able to make loads of money in selling drones, whether that's the technology for drones or whether it's the intelligence needed, I suppose, like the people, the bodies, able to kind of control those things. And then you have surveillance technology. You have the taking up across the world of different forms of surveillance. And like I said earlier, that doesn't just mean like physically, cameras or wires, but actually the research and the logic. And so you see also like masses of funding going into PhDs that focus on surveillance, that focus on counter extremism, focus on radicalization. So I think there's a lot of different avenues. And the thing is, these beneficiaries don't work separately. There are often a lot of overlap between them. And I talk in the book about, for example, an APPG, an all-party parliamentary group that is run by a neoconservative think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, who, again, are funded massively by the same people who donate to, the Tory party, Republican Party, and to other Islamophobic think tanks. And then in this same APPG, you have the chair of BAE Systems, an arms
Right.
manufacturing company who sell arms to places where wars are justified through Islamophobic narratives. So, there's a lot of overlap. But I suppose the point that I try to make is that these narratives line pockets. They really benefit those whose entire rationale for these industries, the entire rationale for security industry is that the world is facing the biggest threat it's ever faced, and that's a Muslim threat. And so the more narratives you can produce that kind of uphold that, the more money you can make for the technology that you sell in response to that. And then also the research itself can be sold and bought. You have the government paying thousands of pounds to these independent research think tanks, quote unquote independent, to produce the knowledge or the research that can then justify, their policies. So I think when we talk about things like a security industrial complex, that complex is really a reflection of all those mutually beneficial relations that are deep and complicated, and that include, individuals who are funded by bodies, and they're producing narratives at different levels to the news corporations, and then they're producing narratives at a different level to the research bodies. But I think all of it is linked, and all of it definitely benefits a global military and security industry.
I think the book is really sort of fantastic at making or laying bare just how sort of structural these questions are. And, it's clear that we need to move our demands beyond calling for sort of better representation in, the mainstream media or whatever. So what are the main, I guess, conclusions or ideas or actions or anything that you hope people who have read your book will take away from it?
Well, I think something really important to me was that I don't need everybody to read the book and say, right, I'm going to now be campaigning against Islamophobia. I think what I actually wanted people to take from this is that in the work that we already do, wherever you're situated, whatever kind of, I don't know, industry or place that you find yourself in, I think because Islamophobia is so broad and so embedded, chances are that there is a way that your work is kind of either upholding or entwined with some of these security policies, maybe counter-extremism, or maybe just a broader kind of narrative that is Islamophobic. And so I think asking people just to try to denaturalize that. We talked earlier about language and the importance of naming things. And so one of the invitations I make in the book for everybody on a very small and personal scale is kind of raising those questions, thinking about the language that we use, but then also that, there are direct demands that we need to make in terms of pieces of legislation. We must demand the repeal of prevent. We must demand the repeal of secret courts. Spoke earlier about citizenship removal. Well, most of the cases where it's removed, people don't have access to the evidence because there's the use of secret courts. That's something that must be repealed. And I think the deeper then demands that build on the back of that, and the call that I tried to make is that if we're going to really try to uproot Islamophobia, then we also have to take these kinds of logics of resistance to their furthest conclusion, which means, okay, well, we need to resist any and all racialized preemptive policing. And that includes, any form of stop and search that associates a crime with a particular body. And I think for me, there was this abolitionist current that I really wanted to tap into with the book. And one of the biggest themes is that if we want to build a safer world, I think on its own terms, counter-extremism, counter-terrorism, all these industries built on the back of Islamophobia have not made us safer. And in fact, I think they reveal, in many cases, places where people have been made so much less safe. And so I think the other invitation that I'm kind of trying to make through the book is more of an imaginative one in terms of, what alternatives might we build to this system? What would happen if we had a fully funded healthcare system, fully funded social services? What would happen if we released everyone from immigration detention centers? What would happen if we had, housing that was accessible? What would that actually, perhaps that would deal with a lot of the questions that we put under the banner of security concerns, which are actually just questions of people accessing safety and having their needs met and their vulnerabilities dealt with. So I think there's a few levels. The invitation is personally, how can you shift the discourse? What demands can we actually make in terms of activism and organization? And I think there, earlier you mentioned there's not a lot of organized groups of Muslims who can resist Islamophobia because of the coercion. So, also what about solidarity and alliances here? Who are the organizations who could be making those claims more loudly and more clearly without facing the same repercussions as Muslims? And then lastly, what are the further demands that we need to make if we're really serious about tackling the roots of Islamophobia, which are the same roots that are the roots of all racism, that are linked to capitalism and this broader colonial world system, which has to include, for me, anti-imperialism, that, this goes beyond simply national boundaries. It's not enough to eradicate Islamophobia within the UK. It has to be bigger than that. So, I hope there's different levels of invitations there that I make to readers, and ultimately something that everybody can do, I hope.
Absolutely. Well, Suhaiymah, thank you so much for what's been a really interesting discussion. As I say, I love the book. I think everyone should, read it, get their hands on a copy. Podcast listeners can get 50% off, which is our standing discount. So you can get that through plutobooks.com, and you just use the coupon podcast at the checkout. That was Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan on Radicals and Conversation. If you've enjoyed today's show, then don't forget to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform it is you're listening. And of course, please do share the link online as well. We'll be back in May with another episode. So until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.